How dare they charge $10,000 for an Etta watch? Always better than in-house movement is garbage.
Who says you can trust an Etta movement?
So is it necessarily always about Etta versus in-house? What do we know about Etta? Well, we know it's more affordable, it's easier to maintain, it's like a trusted friend. On the other hand, in-house movements are more glamorous, more prestigious, pricier, but is it worth it? Yeah, that's a good topic for today's show. Let's make this into today's show. Alright, hi guys, it's your boy Rich here, back at it again. And whenever we compare an Etta movement with an in-house movement, it's not necessarily Team Etta versus Team in-house, because we respect the Etta movement. We know it's a lot easier to maintain, it's reliable, it's like a trusted friend, whereas an in-house movement may be more glamorous and prestigious. But we put our foot down defending Etta whenever we see a watch using its movement and charging $5,000 or more. Except there is this one watch which we allow to get away with it. We have to be careful not to minimize in-house movements as anything more than overpriced, because that's our emotions acting without the benefit of intellect. The watches that use in-house movements are the ones that are going to be around in the long term. If we look at watches that used to charge several $1,000s for using an Etta movement, we notice they're no longer around. Let's start with one offshoot brand, Fred's. Do you remember Fred's? The first time I noticed Fred's was from Bad Boys 2, where I saw Will Smith's character wearing this watch. Smith's character had money in the movie. He drove a Ferrari, so I figured this watch must also be expensive. And it was. The watch was around $5,500 at the time. It was also only using an Etta movement. And now Fred's no longer makes men's watches. They are a jeweler to only women's. Or how about Bidet & Company? Back in the day, I used to like the number 8. Bidet offered a unique service. They had a concierge service.
This is the concierge.
Similar to black card holders, where you would get certain privileges and perks such as tickets to certain events. And that was a really nice feature. However, it was a watch that only used an Etta movement and would charge $5,000 to $6,000 to $7,000. And they're no longer available as well. Or how about more recently, Jean Richard? Jean Richard is not exactly in the same situations as Bidet and Fred's, who both make watches only for women. But Jean Richard is no longer available in the US because they don't have US distribution. They are strictly available in European and Asian countries. And even though those are 3 recent examples of watches that charge several $1,000s for an Etta movement, there's a long history of those watches as well who have been sent to pasture. There used to be brands like Ebel, Baume Mercier, Concorde, Franck Muller. All those watches charge several $1,000s for using an Etta movement, and we no longer tolerated spending that kind of money on an Etta movement. And those watches are no longer around, or if we can find them, they're for pennies on the dollar. There are a few jewelry house watches that were on the verge of suffering the same fate as those other brands, but they adapted. And we're talking Tiffany's, Cartier, and Hermes. All of these watch brands now use an in-house movement, and as a result, they are now thriving instead of being stagnant. Along the same veins, there is another watch that I feel needs to make some tweaking to their brand, and we're talking Ralph Lauren watches. When Ralph Lauren watches came out, they were well received. Their debut was huge, an enormous amount of fanfare, because their movements were being made by Richemont. But they are now kind of fading away. People are losing interest in the Ralph Lauren watches. So Ralph Lauren needs to really either up their game and start using an in-house movement, or they might suffer the same fate as their flagship Madison Avenue store in New York, which is now closed because they are considered outdated. There is a difference between a true in-house movement and a movement made exclusively for a certain brand. Ralph Lauren uses a movement made exclusively for them, which is the closest kind of movement to a true in-house movement. This is sort of akin to a custom-made suit versus a bespoke suit. A custom-made suit is a suit built completely from scratch around your body's measurements, whereas a bespoke suit already has a foundation there and is pre-cut and then altered to your body's measurements. We know that a watch brand doesn't necessarily have to charge us an arm and a leg for an in-house movement. Look at Christopher Ward and Nomos, for example. I'm not really a big fan of Christopher Ward yet, but I am of Nomos. And both of those watches are selling for an affordable price with an in-house movement. Yes, granted, Nomos doesn't make the most complicated and sophisticated movements, but they're also not fragile and they are reliable. But perhaps the biggest example is with Tudor. Tudor now makes an in-house movement, and they sent a message to the rest of the watch world announcing, look, we can make a really quality in-house movement with a 70 hours of power reserve, and not not charge an arm and a leg. In fact, the Black Bays with the in-house movements retail for about $4,000, which is not a significant amount over their previous ETA-based version. Tudor also needed to do this. The first time around in the US, they were a failure. They were considered the poor version of Rolex, or a poor man's Rolex. So in around 2013, they relaunched themselves, and they were well received. They were heralded. They got a lot of press. But shortly after that, the sales started to wane. So they had to adapt quickly, and that's when they started making their in-house movement, because Tudor could not afford to fail the second time in a row. If they did, Tudor would be done in the US.
There is no tomorrow.
And as a consequence, the Black Bay sales have gone up significantly to where they were when the 2013 versions launched. I mean, Tudor is never going to get out of Rolex's shadow, but Tudor actually needs Rolex, a lot like Kobe needed Shaq, or Cisco needed Ebert, or Ebert needed Cisco, because it needs to be compared to something to show that they are offering a real value watch with an in-house movement. It may never get away from, oh, it's a poor man's Rolex. It may never get away from Big Brother's shadow, but Tudor needs Rolex to be compared to represent the value of those watches. There are a lot of us who believe, buy the watch that you like and screw what everyone else thinks, and I'm a part of that camp. But I wouldn't necessarily use a blanket statement for that, because that's not a smart decision. If we're going to spend $5,000 on a watch, we have to realize if it's an ETA-based movement, chances are that watch is going to suffer the same fate as all those other watches put to pasture. And when we're talking several $1,000s, that's a lot of lost sleep. And here's a great personal example. About 2004, 2005, I bought Javrill's Avenue of the Americas. And at that time, it retailed for about $5,000. And that was an ETA-based movement. But today, it's pennies on the dollar. If we can find one, we can get one for about $400. So that would have been really sad if I actually kept that watch, knowing that it's a worthless watch right now. But fortunately for me, I was able to return that watch as I started to notice that this watch is no $5,000 watch. There were all kinds of problems with that watch. But if I wasn't fortunate enough to return that watch, that would have been a really sad purchase decision, and I would still probably be paying for that today. So the lesson is, if we're going to spend several $1,000s on a watch, it probably should not be using an ETA movement, because chances are it won't carry any financial value down the road. At the top of the show, I mentioned there is one watch who can get away with this, and we're talking the Omega Speedmaster Man on the Moon watch using the Hesalite crystal and the Lamania movement. The Lamania movement is not part of Omega's in-house coaxial movement, but Omega can get away with charging $5,000 for that watch because it was the first watch worn on the moon. And unless there is another significant historical achievement, no other watch can get away with what Omega is getting away with. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you the next time. The blanket statement would result in our emotions acting without the benefit of intellect. Buy what you like, screw everyone else. No, buy what you like, screw what everyone else thinks. The jewelry houses are Breakfast at Tiffany's, Cartier, and Hermes. What? Breakfast at Tiffany's?